On the cliff above the gray Atlantic stood Bellhurst, a brick orphanage whose walls had already weathered storms older than the children it held. The air around it always carried a taste of salt and rust, as though the sea was eating the building from the outside in. To strangers, the orphanage looked proud and steady, its copper cupola flashing like a beacon when the clouds broke. But to those who lived inside, the cupola was never a light. It was a mouth. When the wind struck it at the right angle, a low hum bled through the rafters and pressed against the bones of every child. A sound they learned to live with but never grew used to. It was not the hum of comfort or safety, but the hum of something that measured them without ever speaking. Bellhurst had rules, and they were spoken with the softness of promises rather than threats. The matron, a woman with smooth hair pulled tight and dresses without crease, told donors and visitors that the children must be protected from intrusion. Cameras were not allowed, she explained, because photographs could fall into the wrong hands. Mirrors were not needed, she insisted, because vanity was poison for young souls. No visitor questioned her, for her words came with a gentle smile and a ledger so carefully written it looked more sacred than administrative. She did not bark or strike. She coaxed with calm words and patient silences. That calmness hid the depth of her obsession. Children must exist without record, without proof, without reflection. Only then, she believed, were they pure enough to be shaped. Children arrived in wagons, their names scribbled on paper tags pinned to coats. They stepped across the threshold, leaving behind family, memory, and whatever small belongings they carried. At Bellhurst, the first act was always the same. The tags were removed, burned quietly in a small iron dish, and the names were rewritten into the ledger in the matron's neat hand. Some names would later be crossed out, but never in a way that smudged the ink. Every line remained elegant, as if the handwriting itself was proof of moral order. For the children, the ritual meant the same thing. They entered with one identity and left with none. They became pieces in a system so polished it seemed harmless, even when it stripped them of all anchors. Inside, the air was scrubbed until it smelled faintly of bleach and lye. Floors gleamed as though footsteps themselves were offenses. Windows were washed until they blurred the outside world into a smear of gray light. The children were taught to walk quietly in the corridors, not because anyone shouted at them, but because the very house seemed to correct them. A footstep too sharp echoed in strange ways, the sound traveling through vents and returning as a hollow vibration under their skin. They learned quickly to soften their movements, to still their breathing, to make themselves fit the silence the building demanded. To survive Bellhurst, one had to shrink into its rhythm. Visitors often remarked that the orphanage felt unusually calm. Children sat straight in pews during Sunday service, their faces placid, their voices reduced to a careful hum of hymn tones. The matron would smile at these remarks, tilting her head as though she herself was surprised by their discipline. She never mentioned that discipline came not from punishment, but from the architecture itself. The iron rafters above, the copper cupola that caught the wind, the strange pattern of vents that carried air through every floor, all these were more than decoration. They were instruments of control, carefully tuned to measure how still and obedient a body could be. At night, when the fog rolled against the cliff and the waves below tore themselves against stone, the hum of the cupola grew louder. Children lay awake in rows of narrow beds, the vibration pressing through their ribs like a heartbeat that was not their own. Some whispered that the hum was the house speaking to them. Others pressed their ears into pillows and tried to make themselves vanish into the mattress. The matron insisted it was only the weather, but she listened too. Her head tilted, her eyes closed, as though the sound was a hymn meant for her alone. She believed the house itself was her partner, her confidant, her proof that silence and order could be carried into the bones of children until they were no longer children at all. From the outside, Bellhurst appeared as a place of safety, neat records, steady routines, and spotless halls. Inside, every child learned that safety was not comfort, but surrender. They could not hold on to names, faces, or even the memory of what they once looked like. They became part of the hum, part of the ledger, part of the calm that outsiders admired without understanding. And as each new storm rolled in from the Atlantic, the cupola sang a little louder, testing the rafters, vibrating the walls, and reminding all who listened that the house itself demanded obedience. The chapter closes not with screams or blood, but with the sound of that low, steady hum, sliding through brick and bone alike. It was the first lesson Bellhurst ever taught, the constant presence behind every rule. That hum was more than sound, it was architecture, discipline, doctrine. And soon, it would reveal the purpose it had been built for. The ledger was kept in a leather-bound book with corners rubbed smooth by time, always resting on a small table beside the matron's desk. It was never locked away, never hidden, because it did not need to be. Its cover bore no title, only a dark oil sheen from the matron's fingers. Those who glimpsed it might assume it contained donation records or hymn rosters, and it did. The front pages were filled with neat lines, linen shipments from a church guild, jars of powdered milk from a local grocer, a winter coat delivered with a boy's initials still faintly embroidered inside. There were entries for choir practice times, ink-stamped reminders for inspections, and a long-running schedule of grace meditations held every Sunday at dusk. Everything was symmetrical, clean, and kind, but deeper into the book, past the appearances and platitudes, the ink changed slightly. Not in color or penmanship, those remained perfect, but in tone. Here the word transfer appeared more often. Not the kind of transfer that involved paper trails and proper signatures, but brief, soft entries like transferred 8YO, male, bronchial concerns, peaceful, or moved to silent care 6YO, female, no family record, amen. Each line seemed carefully crafted to say nothing wrong. They carried the shape of medical notes or administrative summaries, but they spoke with the whisper of burial prayers. Even the word peaceful was used too frequently, as though being too quiet to resist had become a diagnosis. The matron's handwriting never faltered. Her letters curled just slightly at the bottom, as though each word bowed in reverence to something larger than itself. She did not scribble or edit. When a child left, truly left, she did not erase. She drew a single thin line through the name. Not bold enough to deface, but enough to signal, this one has passed through. Some names had dates next to them. Others did not. A few had only initials logged in the same perfect line, then struck out weeks later with no accompanying comment. On rare occasions, she added small annotations: obedient, weak knees, or resisted the milk. To anyone else, these would mean nothing. To her, they were markers, sacred notations in a system of moral sorting that only she understood. She believed, with a conviction that bordered on holy madness, that every child who came to Bellhurst had been broken before they arrived. Broken by neglect, by poverty, by birth itself. Her role, as she saw it, was not to fix them, but to ease them toward stillness. Her ledger was not a book of punishments, it was a gospel of relief. Each name crossed out was not a death. It was, in her mind, a final kindness. The ones who left in wagons under night fog with no destination filed had not been taken. They had been released. The matron had convinced herself that her job was not to care for the living, but to curate the exit of the lost in a manner so clean, so precise, so soft, that no one would ever call it cruelty. At the back of the ledger were the prayer entries. These were not sermons or devotions, but logs, meticulous lists of the children who had attended each quiet hour. These events were always held in the basement hall beneath the chapel, where children sat in rows of wool blankets and were asked to listen to the air. The matron said it was where they learned to feel peace as it moved through the body. But the children knew that quiet hour was something else. After each session, a few were always sent for special meals or long rest. The prayer logs recorded which child had sat where, how still they had been, whether their hands trembled. Over time, patterns emerged. The most still children went missing first. Their names were always crossed out later, always with care, always in silence. One name near the center of the book had 2 lines through it. Not just the usual crossing out, but a second, heavier stroke, shaky, almost reluctant. The entry read, LBG7YO recited verse during quiet hour. Pulse too high, retained. Then, 5 days later, LBG relented during breath exercise, calm, transfer approved. No further details, no destination. But beneath the entry in faint pencil was a single number, 417. This number did not match any page, room, or bed at Bellhurst. It would be the thread that led to what lay beneath the orphanage. To the rooms not listed on any map. To the spaces where sound was measured and stillness was enforced. The ledger remained open on the matron's table every night. Its pages fluttered sometimes in the wind that slipped through the cupola's iron slats. When the bell hum passed through the walls, the ink on those pages seemed to tremble, as if the house itself remembered each name. And when new children arrived and tags were removed and burned, the matron would smile gently, dip her pen, and add a new line with the same gentle hand she used for prayer. No one ever asked how many lines had been crossed out. And no one ever asked why, once a name had been struck, it was never spoken aloud again. There were no mirrors in Bellhurst. Not in the dormitories, not in the washrooms, not even the staff quarters. The matron said they made children vain, that they encouraged selfishness and distraction. She told this to donors and parish visitors with the same calm smile she used for everything. Our children are learning to be known by character, not reflection. Most visitors nodded, charmed by the phrasing, then quietly forgot what had been said. But the truth behind it was much colder. Bellhurst's children grew up not knowing their own faces. Their bodies existed, yes, they felt them, fed them, trained them, but their identities floated, never anchored to anything solid. What was removed was not just vanity, but certainty. When the sun struck the windows at a sharp enough angle, some children would search the polished floors for hints of themselves, smudges of a chin, a shadow of a cheek, but even those would vanish under the matron's daily inspections. Any surface that gave back even a ghost of reflection was covered or buffed to dullness. Even the tin basins used for morning washing were warped, their curves never smooth enough to hold a full image. There was no glass in picture frames. There were no portraits, no silhouettes cut from black paper. Bellhurst erased not just the face, but the idea of face. In time, the children stopped looking. Without mirrors, they learned not to expect feedback. They adjusted their clothes by feel, not sight. They studied one another's faces with the quiet urgency of starving people watching others eat, and yet they could never be certain what parts of those faces resembled their own. The staff were trained to avoid personal remarks, even compliments. "You've grown tall" was allowed. "You look well" was not. Appearance, the matron said, was a door to vanity, and vanity led to disorder. The erasure did something else too. It softened memory. When inspectors came to visit, children answered questions politely, but there was something distant in their speech, as if they floated just behind their own names. They did not remember birthdays or favorite colors. They hesitated when asked to describe what they looked like when they arrived. One girl, when asked by a visitor what color her eyes were, blinked and said quietly, "I think they're quiet." More than one inspector noted the stillness. Children at Bellhurst moved with a slowness that was not sleepy but trained. Their steps made little sound. They sat without fidgeting. They never interrupted. Their expressions did not shift much. The house had taught them to behave like echoes, not voices. This was not discipline in the traditional sense, no threats, no bruises. It was something subtler, something that rewired the instincts. It began, many believed, with the air. The architecture of Bellhurst, its deep brick corridors, narrow halls, and high ceilings, was tuned in such a way that sound moved strangely. One child whispering in a stairwell could be heard 2 floors above. A cough in the east wing might echo in the west like a distant footstep. At night, the children whispered only in breaths, afraid of what parts of themselves might travel. Sound behaved as though it were watched. The matron knew this, of course. She had selected the building decades prior, not for its charm or sturdiness, but for its bones. She had walked it alone before any child had arrived, humming gently under her breath, listening to how her voice moved through the rafters. She had clapped her hands in each room and noted the return of the sound. The ones that returned sharply were used for meals. The ones that swallowed noise became dormitories. The rooms where sound lingered too long were sealed entirely. By the time children arrived, the house had already decided what kind of voices it would allow. Loud ones disappeared quickly, not punished but moved elsewhere to new placements or quiet rooms. The remaining children absorbed the lesson like breath. Noise draws attention, and attention is dangerous. Even their laughter, when it came, was often silent. A shaking of the shoulders, a widening of the eyes, a release of air through the nose. It was not just that they were quiet. It was that they were absent in a way no child should be. No drawings of themselves. No birthday cards. No reflections. They became used to the idea that proof was something that could be removed. A girl might sleep beside the same bunkmate for months and never learn their last name. A boy might eat breakfast across from the same face every morning and still flinch if asked to describe it. One night, a new staff member, a volunteer from a nearby town, remarked that the halls seemed darker than they should. Another staff member replied without thinking, "That's because voices travel better in the dark." The words hung in the air like a secret spoken too plainly. Neither spoke again for the rest of the night. In Bellhurst, sound carried like memory, stretched, thinned, and scattered. The house did not need mirrors or photographs to monitor its children. It only needed walls that listened better than eyes. And soon the house would begin to speak back, not in words but in vibration, in tone, in frequency. The children who had forgotten their faces were about to learn what their bones remembered. They were called tone braces, though no child ever heard that name spoken aloud. They arrived in unmarked wooden crates, each piece wrapped in gray felt, smelling faintly of oil and wax. At first glance, they resembled the kinds of orthodontic tools used to shape young jaws, delicate, smooth, and clean. But these were not medical instruments. They were not designed to fix speech. They were designed to erase it. The brace fitted behind the teeth, resting softly against the roof of the mouth, held in place with a slight pressure that made swallowing more deliberate and speech nearly impossible. Not painful, never painful. That was the genius of it. Just enough tension to make talking feel unnatural. Just enough to make silence feel safe. The matron never described them as punishment. She called them training aids. She explained to inspectors that the children were learning breath control, posture, and stillness through silent harmonic alignment. That phrase, printed neatly in the hymn rotation log, gave everything the sheen of reform and devotion. In reality, it meant this: each child became an instrument, and Bellhurst was the hand that tuned them. At dawn, children assembled barefoot on the wooden floor of the east chamber. Their feet aligned with lines etched faintly into the boards, carved not by staff but by years of repetition. They wore simple linen gowns, mouths fitted with the braces, hands down, eyes ahead. No one spoke. The room was lit not by candles but by narrow skylights. Soft, silver beams that never showed the sun, only the idea of it. Then, the tuning fork. It was stored in the cupola above, suspended in a metal cradle that swayed slightly with the wind. The fork itself was larger than any child's arm, made of tempered brass and set to a frequency the matron believed could purify the soul. She would not strike it herself. That was done by a silent staff member trained to do so only at precise intervals. When struck, the vibration passed through the copper lining of the cupola, into the iron beams of the roof, and down into the wooden ribs of the orphanage itself. The children did not sing. Singing was forbidden. Instead, they were taught to hum, not a melody, not a note, but a resonance. Their bodies were to receive the tuning fork's vibration and answer it with their own. If the room was in perfect compliance, the two sounds, machine and human, would create a harmonic wave that made the very air thicken. The matron believed this wave quieted the blood, softened the heart, and broke resistance without force. She called it the alignment. The children simply called it mourning. To ensure posture, the children wore wooden harnesses across their backs. These were not strapped tightly, only enough to prevent slouching. A child who slumped would feel the brace dig into their spine, a subtle, creeping ache that built slowly over hours. In time, they stopped resisting. Their shoulders found the right angle. Their spines obeyed. The house never shouted. It whispered. And that was worse. Sometimes, if a child's hum drifted too far from the tuning fork's tone, the staff would mark it in the alignment log. The matron kept detailed records of who held the note and who fell short. Names marked too often were sent to resonance reinforcement, a solitary exercise room where the fork's vibration was piped directly through the walls at full volume. There, the hum was no longer gentle, it became physical. The ribs vibrated. The ears rang. The eyes blurred. When the child emerged, they were quieter. Always. Some children took to the braces so well that they no longer removed them. They would sleep with the brace still in place, humming faintly as they dreamed. The matron watched these children with something close to reverence. She believed they were proof of her design, that the human body, stripped of ego and noise, could become a vessel for perfect obedience. She believed their bones were learning to sing the way metal sings when it cools. Visitors were never allowed in the east chamber during alignment. If asked, the matron explained it was a private time of reflection. But on quiet mornings, anyone standing outside the eastern wing could feel the floorboards hum under their feet. Not music, not song, just vibration, like a giant breath held between walls. One morning, a small boy, new, not yet broken in, shifted his weight during alignment. The brace in his mouth clicked faintly. His shoulders sagged. The tuning fork rang again, louder this time. The vibration passed down from the cupola, through beam and brace and into the floor beneath him. He flinched, not from pain but from recognition. Something in the sound had found him. As the children were dismissed in silence, the boy lingered. He followed the vibration into the stairwell, drawn like a thread pulling tight through the marrow, and the house followed him down. It was not just the children who were shaped by Bellhurst. The building itself was part of the method. From cellar to attic, every beam, pipe, and floorboard was arranged with cold precision, not for beauty, not even for efficiency, but for control. The house was alive in the way a trap is alive, not sentient, but reactive. It did not think. It responded. And in Bellhurst, motion had consequences. The vents were not simply ducts for air. They were channels for surveillance. Long, narrow passages lined with hollow brass tubes that stretched from the base of the walls to the crown of the cupola. They wound through plaster and stone, vanishing behind false panels and beneath floorboards, perfectly tuned to carry even the faintest sound. A whisper in the dormitory could be heard in the matron's office 2 floors below. The matron never rushed to punish. She merely noted the time, the location, and waited. Eventually, the child would come to her, frightened, ashamed, unsure of how she knew, and she would greet them with a soft smile and a line already drawn in the ledger. The house had spoken for them. Even the floors were instruments. Grates were spaced at exact intervals, every 13 paces, every 10 feet, down corridors and halls. Beneath those grates, the same brass tubes that carried sound now served another function: vibration. When a child moved too quickly, the motion disturbed the airflow. The vents responded with a low, tremoring hum. It was not loud. It was felt. A rumble that lived in the knees, a pulsing that clung to the spine. No words, no correction. Just a warning, deep and quiet, that traveled through bone. If the child stopped moving, the pressure eased. If they remained still, the vibration stopped completely. The lesson taught itself. Obedience brought silence. Movement brought judgment. The metal ribs within the walls, hidden behind plaster and wainscoting, were not support beams. They were tuning rods, crafted and arranged by the same hand that installed the massive fork in the cupola. Every hallway, every classroom, every prayer room had its own resonance pattern. These patterns were never spoken of, but they were used. The matron knew which wing punished fidgeting, which staircase punished hesitation, which dormitory punished breath too fast or too loud. Children learned not to ask questions. They learned not to shift in bed, not to cough, not to cry. Their bodies remembered what their minds could not explain. When the house disapproved, it did not strike. It shook. Bellhurst had no locked doors. It didn't need them. Children did not run. They froze. Even the smallest disobedience, stepping too loudly, laughing at the wrong time, might cause a section of the floor to thrum beneath their toes. A cold whisper through the soles that reminded them they were not alone. The house heard. The house reacted. And over time, the children came to believe what the matron had always known, that stillness was survival. Every child had their own rhythm, their own particular pulse. The house, with its humming core and metallic nerves, was designed to erase those rhythms, to flatten them, to replace the disorder of individuality with one universal tempo. Some children resisted at first. They ran, they screamed, they kicked at the floorboards. But the house was patient. It did not punish in haste, it waited. The walls would vibrate softly through the night. The air would grow thinner in rooms where defiance had been detected. The children would not be hurt. They would simply stop sleeping well. They would stop eating as much. They would begin to tremble, not from pain, but from some frequency they could not name, something that lived just beneath hearing. By the third week, even the boldest child walked like a ghost. They stood with backs perfectly straight, not from pride, but from a desire not to wake the house. They breathed carefully. They chewed slowly. The body, stripped of reflection and sound, became a vessel for stillness. The matron wrote of it in her private margin notes, not part of the ledger, but kept in a separate black book locked in a drawer. She called it entrainment. She believed the body could be brought into submission through environmental rhythm. That sound and architecture together could subdue the will more cleanly than violence ever could. It was not cruelty. It was refinement. She did not harm the children. She tuned them. One morning before dawn, the cupola bell let out a hum so deep it rattled the windows without breaking them. Every child froze where they stood. Some in line for washing, some still curled in bed, others halfway through dressing. The vibration held them for 23 seconds. The only movement was the flicker of candlelight. Then just as suddenly the bell stopped. Total silence, and in that silence something was confirmed. The bell only ceased when every child had stopped. When every heart had stilled, every breath lowered, every motion erased. The building's design was complete. It no longer required discipline. It had become the discipline. What came next would not be corrected. It would be worship. The matron called it care, though its edges were sharp enough to cut through bone. She believed peace was not an emotion but a state of the body, a measurable condition, and that children could be trained into it the way wood is bent with steam. Her doctrine was simple. A quiet body meant a quiet soul. And so every practice at Bellhurst turned toward stillness, not only of voice or movement, but of the heart itself. Meals were crafted not for nourishment, but for control. Bowls of porridge thickened with powdered lime, cups of weak tea stretched thin with water, and bread so dense it sat in the stomach like stone. These foods slowed the body, softened its pulse, dampened its restlessness. The children did not know why they always felt heavy after meals, why their hearts beat like muffled drums instead of quick rattles. They only knew that hunger never quite left them, but the urge to run, to shout, to resist dulled over time. The matron would watch as spoons scraped bowls, noting which children finished with calm composure and which trembled with impatience. To her, eating was not about survival, it was the first ritual of obedience. After supper came sleep training. Each bed had a metronome hidden beneath it, its tick softened by cloth until it was felt more than heard. Slow, steady, inevitable. Each child's body learned to match the rhythm, to breathe and rest in the same pattern. Those who struggled against the tempo, children who fidgeted, who whispered in the dark, who cried softly into blankets, were reminded that stillness was rewarded, while agitation only brought more nights of training. Over time, even nightmares grew quieter, as though the house itself absorbed their cries and pressed them back into silence. The doctrine reached its purest form in the weekly trials. Quiet Week was what the matron called it, a test of who had learned to calm the body to her standard. Children were observed in every setting: meals, lessons, prayers, chores. Their posture, their heart rate, their breath. Staff carried notebooks that seemed to mark nothing more than chores completed, but in truth they recorded the tempo of a child's pulse, the tension in their hands, the flicker of their eyes when startled. Passing the trial did not require perfection. It required surrender. At the end of each Quiet Week, the matron gathered the children in the East Chamber. Her voice was soft, her hands folded. She would speak of kindness, of peace, of the blessing of a body that could rest without resistance. Then came the ribbons, small strips of blue silk, tied neatly and pinned to the chest of those who passed. For a child who received one, there was a flicker of pride, even if it was fleeting. The ribbon meant safety. It meant approval. It meant the vibrations would not follow them that week. Children without ribbons sat still and pale, their eyes on the floor, already carrying the weight of failure. But the ledger told a different story. For every ribbon given, there was an entry. Not all ribbons were equal. Some names beside their ribbon mark were underlined. Others carried the faint notation transferred. These notations never returned. They were not rescinded, not corrected, not questioned. A child might leave the chamber with a ribbon pinned proudly to their chest and a smile trembling on their lips. But in the ledger, the space beside their name had already been emptied. Their approval had been their farewell. The matron believed this was mercy. Those who passed had proven themselves ready for true peace. They had slowed their bodies, emptied their voices, subdued their pulses. They were not being punished. They were being released. She thought of it as her final gift, granting stillness so complete that no fear, no hunger, no longing could disturb it again. One week, a boy named Samuel earned his ribbon. He was thin, smaller than the others, with a heartbeat always quick from nerves. The staff had expected him to fail, but during Quiet Week, he became suddenly calm. He ate slowly, his eyes downcast. He breathed in rhythm with the metronome, his hands folded tight in his lap. When he received his ribbon, his lips curved into the faintest smile. The others envied him. But in the ledger beneath Samuel W., there was no check mark, only a blank space. And next to it, in careful script, the word, transferred. The ribbon was found later, folded on the matron's desk, pressed flat between the ledger's pages. No child ever saw Samuel again. The records were always in order. Dates aligned. Seals were clean. Every transfer of a child from Bellhurst came with the appropriate forms. Ink dried straight, names spelled perfectly, and the matron's signature just slightly arched at the final stroke, like a hymn trailing off at its last note. The destinations were modest mills and boarding schools deeper inland, places with iron fences and long halls, where it made sense that a quiet child from the coast might be sent for further discipline or apprenticeship. On paper, nothing was amiss. But in the world beyond parchment, no one could find them. The wagons came only at night. Always the same design. A wide, low frame with canvas sides and iron-rimmed wheels that cut silent grooves into the wet earth. No one in town ever claimed to have built them. No blacksmith recalled fitting their rims, no stableman admitted to housing their horses. And yet they came. Just past the last bell toll, just before the sky lightened, drawn by animals whose eyes reflected lantern light too perfectly, whose breath made no sound. They waited without rest outside Bellhurst's side gate, where the cliff road met the tree line. The gate itself was rarely used by anyone else. The children never saw it during the day. But on transfer nights it opened without a creak. Each departure followed the same pattern. The matron would descend the east corridor with a ledger pressed to her chest. A child, sometimes two, walked silently behind her, blue ribbons pinned neatly, eyes focused on nothing. There was no weeping, no resistance. These were the ones who had passed every trial. They did not flinch as the house opened its mouth to let them go. The driver was a man no one knew by name. Tall, with pale gloves and a hat pulled low. He never dismounted. He did not speak. The matron handed him a sealed envelope. He nodded once. The children climbed aboard. The canvas closed. The town knew of these shipments. They were not blind. The road curved directly past the southern fields, visible from nearly every cottage window. Those who watched from a distance said the wagon left no ruts, said the wheels turned silently even over gravel, said it vanished behind the fog before reaching the main path, as if the trees themselves closed behind it. Occasionally questions were asked. A curious mother whose daughter had once lived at Bellhurst might inquire about her placement. A foreman at one of the listed mills might glance through transfer papers and find no matching name on any of his records. But these questions faded quickly. The matron responded with kindness. She produced new paperwork or redirected the query to the office of placement in a town 2 counties away. By the time a reply was due, the letter would vanish or the questioner would lose interest. Bellhurst was efficient. Grief had no purchase on its walls. Years passed. Names kept leaving the ledger, but none ever returned. And slowly the town grew quieter too. Stores stopped selling sweets near the orphanage gates. Local families stopped visiting the grounds. The chapel, once a site of joint services between children and town parishioners, grew empty on Sundays. Bellhurst was not hated. It was simply avoided. Too orderly to be questioned. Too silent to be touched. Then came the spring storm. Rain hit harder than it had in years. Wind tore bark from trees. The cliff path flooded, the earth softening into mud. When morning came, part of the road had collapsed into the sea. And with it something else. Half a wagon wheel lodged upright at the edge of the drop. Its rim split clean, its iron band twisted like a broken cuff. The townsfolk found it at dawn. The wood was water-warped but unrotted, the kind of timber rarely used for wagons anymore. No one claimed it. The mill workers studied the make, shook their heads. The undertaker examined the ironwork, found no maker's mark. The blacksmith tried to pry the rim free and snapped a chisel in half. It was the driver's wheel. And the driver had never returned to claim it. Later that week, the town's only doctor stopped by Bellhurst on a routine wellness check. He was shown the children, still quiet, still breathing slow. The matron offered tea. He noticed the teacups were already filled when he arrived. He asked about the transfers. She smiled and said the storm had delayed travel, but that all would resume as soon as the roads were repaired. Then she showed him the ledger, its most recent entry marked with a blue ribbon and the word transferred. Nothing unusual. Nothing suspicious. Just a blank space where a name had once been. The doctor never went back. The town did not speak of the wheel. They buried it behind the chapel in silence, claiming the metal disturbed their dogs. But something had changed. The road was gone. The fog was heavier, and the wagon had not returned. Something had broken in the cycle. And the house, long accustomed to release, would soon need to find another way to unburden itself. The door to the cupola was hidden behind a shelving unit lined with hymnals, bolted to the wall in a way that only the matron and 2 staff members knew how to release. Beyond it, a tight spiral stairwell wound upward, too narrow for comfort, too steep for light. At the top, beneath the copper mouth of the building's tallest point, was the room with the tilted horizon, a chamber not on any blueprint, never listed in inspections, and known to the children only as the place you visited when you stopped asking to leave. It was a circular room, smooth-walled and windowed, though the glass didn't show the world outside. Each pane was hand-painted with landscapes, rolling fields, still lakes, sunrises frozen forever in golden streaks. But they were wrong. Always just slightly wrong. The sun never matched the sky. The hills bent at impossible angles. One showed a moon in daylight. Another showed nothing at all, only gray, featureless mist. The painted glass wrapped the room in a world that did not exist, and in doing so, unhooked the children from the one they knew. What no child ever noticed, at least not right away, was that the floor moved. Slowly. Too slowly to see. But it turned round and round, completing a full revolution only once every few hours. The motion was deliberate, mechanized, concealed within the floor's frame, and it was so faint that even adults failed to recognize it until their balance betrayed them. The children would stand in the center, barefoot, the floor gently rotating beneath them, the painted horizons blurring over time. At first they believed they were dizzy, but soon they believed the world was. There was no furniture in the room, no sound but the distant thrum of wind against the cupola's ribs. The matron said the chamber was for reflection, for those who needed to realign. It was never used as punishment, only as reward, only for those who had shown discipline. The compliant ones, the still ones, the quiet ones. They were led up the stairwell with praise and soft instruction. They were told they had earned a chance to feel steadiness, and for a while they did. The stillness of the chamber, its gentle motion, its false skies, it all lulled the mind. The body, confused by the turning, adjusted by turning inward. After an hour inside, many children began to sway slightly. After 2, they stood stiff as statues, unsure if they moved at all. The horizon had unspooled from logic. Gravity had become conditional. They were no longer sure what direction the world turned, only that Bellhurst had stopped. The room, spinning as it was, felt like the only fixed point left. They emerged changed. Not bruised, not drugged, but hollowed in a way that could not be undone. Their steps faltered at first. The world outside the cupola pitched unnaturally, even when still. The halls of Bellhurst, once strange, now felt steady, solid, safe. That was the point. The room made the outside world feel dangerous by contrast. It reframed the house, not as a prison but as the one thing that did not move beneath your feet. The children who left the chamber did not resist the doctrine anymore. They returned to their dormitories like they had just woken from sleepwalking, and often they did not speak for days. The staff documented nothing about the room. No formal entries, no schedule, but its presence echoed through the halls in the children's behavior. Those who had stood beneath the painted horizons often showed signs of what the matron called realized stillness. They walked slower, slept deeper, their pulses aligned with the house's rhythm, without training. They no longer blinked when the bell in the cupola rang. They exhaled, as if their bodies had waited for the sound. One boy, no older than 6, returned from the chamber and stood at the edge of the dining hall, his food untouched. When a staff member asked what was wrong, he only murmured, "It doesn't feel still down here." That night he wept, not from pain but from homesickness for a room that didn't exist in the real world. The next morning he asked, "Can I go back to the study room?" He was sent again 2 days later. He did not speak after that. The cupola itself had become the axis of something larger, a turning point not just for the body, but for the soul. The matron believed this deeply. She wrote in her private journal that the room distilled obedience into its final form. "When the ground cannot be trusted," she wrote, "the child trusts only what hums. The bell, the floor, the false sunlit glass, all of it prepared them for what came next. They would no longer need to be convinced. They would volunteer. They would seek stillness like salvation. And when they were ready, truly ready, Bellhurst would offer them one final mercy. There was a wall in the western annex lined with shelves. Simple, wooden boards polished smooth from the oils of many hands. Upon those shelves sat rows of glass jars, each no larger than a soup bowl, each sealed with a cork stopper pressed firm and labeled in perfect penmanship. No child ever touched them unless instructed. No jar was ever opened once sealed, and none were ever thrown away. They called it the breathing ritual, though the staff never used that term aloud. The matron referred to it as a practice in containment. It was introduced gently, like all things in Bellhurst, first as a game, then as a routine, and finally as a requirement. Children were told the jars helped keep their fear safe, that bad feelings, if left inside, could spoil their peace and shake the air around them. The breath, she said, was where fear lived, and the jars were a way to protect the others from it. It started with a simple act. A child was called to the annex. A jar was selected from a cabinet. The matron held it in both hands and whispered a prayer too softly to be heard. Then the child was asked to breathe into the jar, deeply, slowly, steadily. 3 full breaths. Each one fogged the inside of the glass, streaked it with pale condensation. The matron watched closely. If the fog lingered, she smiled. If it disappeared too quickly, she made a note in her pocketbook. Once the 3rd breath was complete, the cork was pressed in with a cloth-wrapped hand. No child saw what happened to the jars after that. But if they listened closely, they might hear a faint squeak of shelf wood, the sound of a name being added to the growing rows above. Each jar was tagged with a strip of linen, marked with the child's initials and a date. Never the full name, only the initials, as if even those letters might unravel if spoken too loudly. Children who resisted the ritual were reminded gently that to hold fear inside was dangerous. That fear unbreathed could become poison, and so they complied. Again and again they were summoned to the annex. Again and again they filled glass with what they were told was fear, but what in truth was more than that. Each breath given away made the next easier. Each jar sealed chipped at the self. The act became something closer to surrender, until children no longer had to be called. Some began to offer their breath unprompted, lining up at the annex door with glass in hand, desperate to be rid of something they could no longer name. The matron cataloged everyone. She kept a second ledger just for breath work, rows of initials, dates, and faint-coded remarks in the margins. Stable. Weak exhale. Unclear intention. Glass warmed in hand. These were not random notes. She believed the breath left traces, not just moisture, but memory, thought, disobedience. If sealed quickly enough, those traces could be contained, frozen like amber. The jars, she said, were sacred. To open them would be to undo the child's progress, and so they remained closed, shelf after shelf, year after year. In time, a pattern emerged. Children with 3 or fewer jars were rarely transferred. They remained in Bellhurst, attending lessons, taking meals, marching in still rows. But those with 5 jars, sometimes 6, began to vanish, quietly, without notice. The night before, they would be called to the annex once more. The final jar was always collected in candlelight, with the matron herself present. She wore white gloves. She lit incense. She asked nothing of the child, only motioned for them to breathe. The cork was pressed in with finality. A wax seal was added, one not used on the others. Those final jars were not placed on the shelves. They were lowered into a wooden box beneath the prayer table. A box marked with a word burned into its lid, passage. No child ever returned from this ritual. The matron logged them as peacefully released or simply complete. In the primary ledger, their names were crossed out with more pressure than usual, the line darker, the ink bleeding slightly through the paper. Some children began to count their jars. They whispered about who had 4, who had 7. They learned to fear the box-marked passage, but also to long for the calm it seemed to promise. The breathwork became not just ritual, it became currency, a form of measurement, a way to know how close one was to stillness, or to something far beyond it. One girl, no older than 8, approached the annex after her 7th jar. She clutched it in both hands, her fingers trembling around the glass. She didn't speak. She simply held it out. The matron did not smile, but she nodded. That night, the bell in the cupola hummed long and low, and the girl's bed was stripped by morning. The house never mourned its lost. It held their breath on its shelves like relics, reminders of how still a soul could become when taught to let go of even the air inside its lungs, and the box beneath the table grew heavier with time. Once a month, after the last prayer had ended and the children had been sent to their dormitories, the orphanage prepared itself for its most secret rite. It began with the bell. Unlike the great tolls heard on Sundays, this was a note too low for the ear, so faint it could not be called a sound at all. It was a vibration, a pressure in the ribs, a heaviness that passed through marrow like water through cloth. The bell did not ring, it breathed. Its pulse spread through every beam and vent of Bellhurst, turning the house into an instrument that played its children instead of protecting them. The vents opened with a hiss, no louder than a sigh. Valves hidden in the walls shifted, adjusting the flow of air in ways no one but the matron understood. Certain corridors thinned, the air just enough to sharpen breath into panic. Other chambers grew rich and heavy, weighted with warmth that lulled the body into compliance. The system was a lung, and the children were trapped within its inhale. Their chests rose and fell against it, never in rhythm, always struggling to match its pulse. The staff moved like shadows, fitting tone braces into waiting mouths. They did not speak as they worked. The children stood in rows, their eyes blank, their shoulders squared by wooden harnesses that reminded their spines of their place. Some already swayed, their knees trembling with the strain of air drawn too shallow. The matron walked between them, her steps silent on the humming floor. She carried no rod, no switch, nothing that could leave a mark. She needed no such thing. The house itself was punishment. The bell's breath was enough. Minutes passed. The hum thickened. The children's faces blurred with stillness, their eyes glassy, their hands folded tight to keep from shaking. The younger ones bent first, their legs folded, not from pain but from a slow surrender to air that no longer filled them. When they sank to the floor, the matron placed a gloved hand upon their heads and whispered a blessing. The staff lifted them gently, carried them away toward the stairwell that led down. No child cried out. The braces made sure of that. It was not selection in the way the outside world might imagine. There was no cruelty shouted aloud, no whip to crack, no order barked. It was patient. It was inevitable. Those who fell were not chosen, they were revealed. The house had listened to their bones, measured their stillness, and decided who had reached the threshold of quiet the matron called peace. And peace, once found, was permanent. The others remained standing. Their ribs trembled with each shallow breath, their eyes fixed forward. They knew what had happened, but they were trained to believe it was mercy. To fall was to rest. To be carried was to be completed. To stand was to remain unfinished, unworthy, still bound to the noise of a body that had not yet surrendered. The doctrine demanded patience, and so they waited, learning to envy those who had gone below. The bell rang again, lower this time, the vibration spreading through the vents until the walls seemed to bow with it. The air thinned one last time. Then the pressure eased. The hum fell quiet. The vents closed, and the house exhaled. The standing children were led back to their dormitories, their steps slow and unsteady, as if they had just crossed a sea in their own lungs. The braces were removed. Their bodies ached with silence. The night passed without speech. But for the few who had been carried away, there was no return. Their beds were stripped before morning. Their names in the ledger were crossed out with steady hand. The matron placed their last jar of breath into the box marked passage. And the door to the cellar, where the soft felted hinges closed without sound, remained shut until dawn. The stairwell that led down to the cellar was narrow, its stone steps worn into shallow curves by decades of quiet feet. There was no lantern hung on the wall, no rope banister to guide the way. Only the sound of the bell's vibration seemed to point the path downward, a hum that grew steadier, calmer, the deeper one descended. At the bottom waited a door padded with thick felt, its hinges wrapped in wool so that even when it closed, no sound escaped. Beyond that door lay the restrooms, and the children who entered never walked out again. The rooms were unlike the rest of Bellhurst. Upstairs, the house was all clean order, brick and iron, polished wood and glass. Down here, everything was softened. The walls were covered in layers of wool batting, muted in color, absorbing every sound. The floors were padded, not with straw or dirt, but with woven mats stitched from coarse cloth. Even the ceiling had been lined with felt so that nothing echoed. The air was thick, almost sweet, as if sound itself had been removed, leaving behind only weight. Inside, rows of narrow cots were arranged with military precision. Each was fitted with a wool blanket so heavy it pressed the chest flat, and a small pillow faintly damp with lavender oil. At the foot of every cot, a metronome ticked. Not sharp, not piercing, but muffled through cloth so that it was felt more than heard. The tempo never changed. Each child who lay down in that cellar was given the same rhythm, the same pulse, until their heart matched it, until their breathing slowed to it, until their bodies stopped fighting against it. Lamps were set along the walls, their light yellow and steady, never flickering, never bright. They did not illuminate the corners. They did not cast shadows. They glowed just enough to make the air visible, as though it too were breathing with the children. The matron called them peaceful lights. Staff called them nothing at all. They tended the lamps as they tended the children, adjusting wicks with silent hands, wiping soot without speaking. When a child was carried into the cellar, there was no protest. By the time they reached the felted door, the air had already thinned in their lungs. The braces had already taught their mouths stillness, and their knees had already folded once. They were placed gently on a cot, tucked beneath the weight of wool, and the metronome was wound. The house did the rest. Its hum seeped through the walls, a low vibration that replaced every thought, every fear. Breath and heartbeat slowed until they were almost indistinguishable from the ticking around them. The children drifted not into sleep, but into something beyond it. Something wordless, something final. The matron described it as the perfect exit. She said no child ever knew fear in those last moments, that no child ever struggled. The doctrine of stillness had been fulfilled. The ledger would be updated before morning, the name crossed through in neat ink. A note written beside it, peaceful transfer. There was no mention of the cellar, no note of wool or metronomes, no record of how long the child's breath lingered in their chest before the hum claimed it. Only those words repeated again and again until they lost meaning. Peaceful transfer. Above ground, the town accepted the papers without question. The orphanage's reputation was too clean, its order too immaculate for suspicion to take root. The authorities read the names, saw the matron's careful hand, and signed their approvals. Not a single photograph was ever requested. Not a single grave marker was ever sought. The children vanished as if they had never existed, folded into silence, filed into ledgers, their last breaths sealed in jars, their bodies surrendered to the cellar of good sleep. And so the cycle continued. One by one, row by row, each cot filled and emptied in turn. The cellar waited, the house hummed, and the world above nodded politely at the paperwork, never once daring to ask what lay beneath the felted door. In 1911, long after the last jar was sealed and the final breath catalogued, a state inquiry began with a single missing child report and a misplaced set of transfer papers. What followed was not a trial, not a reckoning, but a slow leak of documents, of whispers, of frightened former staff, finally willing to name what they had once obeyed. They spoke of quieting methods, of tone braces and metronomes, of air thinned just enough to make a child submit. No graves were ever found, no cause of death ever written. But the ledger was full, and the cellar was real. The legislature responded with shame draped in reform. The Bellhurst Act passed within months. Every child placed in state care would now be photographed on entry and departure. Every adoption verified by a third-party auditor. All sensory suppression devices, tone braces, sleep harnesses, rotational chambers were banned. Institutions once praised for their stillness would now be inspected without warning. And at the cliff where Bellhurst once stood, the town built a memorial from the very bricks that had once swallowed voices. Each brick bears a date from the matron's ledger, though no names because none were kept. And yet, the memory persists. Evil here did not shout. It did not strike. It hummed, it measured. It buried itself in systems that looked like discipline and care. It wrapped cruelty in silence and called it progress. It counted breaths instead of beating them out. It never raised its voice. It didn't have to. The building did that for it. What do you think? Could this happen again behind orderly books and soft words? Where would you hear the low bell today?